I gave you guys the post-it. So what I want you to do is we need to vote on the class representatives, and then I'm going to collect the ballots, and as a democracy, we're going to vote on who we want as our class representative. Simon. So Simon, as a class representative, you were voted.
The act of casting a ballot that gets counted on Election Day is the nation's great equalizer because it is one of the few instances in which our voice, opinions, and the legacy we seek to leave future generations readily crosses the expansive divide that is race and class in this country. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed into law to stop the voter disenfranchisement of people of color in the United States, specifically in the southern United States.
The efforts to get the nation's attention really culminated with the events at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where a group of activists tried to march from Selma to Montgomery in behalf of voting rights, and were met by the Alabama State Police, who beat them and stopped them. Eventually, after going to federal court, the march came off and was a great focus of national attention. Shortly thereafter, Lyndon Johnson took up the idea of passing voting rights legislation and made it happen in quite dramatic fashion in 1965.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was, and still considered, one of the landmark civil rights victories of the modern civil rights movement. And what it sought to do is ban discrimination on the grounds of race for voting.
So as an educator, the dismantling of the Voter Rights Act of 1965 was a huge blow to American democracy.
So there's an actual prohibition against racial discrimination, which is Section 2, but then there are also other tools that they used within the Voting Rights Act to make sure that where it was discrimination was most prevalent, be addressed. So for example, one of the most controversial provisions was Section 5, which you might be aware, essentially required certain states to run by their new voting laws with the federal government because they had a history, like a particularly bad history, of voter discrimination for people of color.
In 2006, Congress went through an extensive process. It compiled a 15,000-page record documenting the continuing need for pre-clearance.
The challenge in Shelby was to Section 5, and what the Supreme Court said is, like, you're right, like that formula doesn't quite work anymore, and there's not nearly as much evidence of this sort of discrimination that once existed in the 60s and before as there is now.
So if Congress wants to resuscitate pre-clearance, it needs to come up with a new coverage formula. It also needs to think about other ways to strengthen the Act in case the new coverage formula is not sufficient to do what the old coverage formula did, and to ensure that voting rights are protected.
Even today, it's not just the South. There are voting irregularities, and minorities, especially African Americans and people who are immigrants, are still often denied the right to vote, and we see irregularities. We see that process being played out, and it's pretty scary. So I think that the need for federal protection, you could still make the case for it today.
Texas immediately announced that it would put its photo ID law into effect. That had been blocked under Section 5. Measures that are designed to reduce participation in the electoral process.
We have far to go before we actually complete the project of having our democracy be fully accessible by everyone.
It is your job to vote. It is your responsibility, your right, and your privilege.